I would like now, without further ado, open the floor. Do not hesitate also to write away your questions in the chat room. So please, just to initiate, Mark, you also very well described how the philosopher John Dewey had a profound impact on him. And he also, in his speeches, in his lectures, Hu Shih suggested, as he said, to be bold in suppositions and be careful in seeking evidence. So could you maybe further develop how the impact on this approach of pragmatism of Dewey on him? He was very much averse to all these ideological approaches. And could you kind of develop this? I think it's
yes. You know, in the 1920s in China, as you know, it was a period of revolutionary change. You know, there was agreement in society that the China they had inherited from the Qing dynasty, and in the early years of Republican period, it was chaotic, backward, feudal. Everything needed to be changed. So there was intense debate about everything. You know, what should we change? How should we change? And I think this is why the isms became so popular. You know, anarchism, communism, socialism, all kind of isms, because they offer you a complete solution. Because the situation then seemed hopeless. You know, China was so far behind the European countries, the United States, Japan. You know, it appeared to need a dramatic change to improve it. But Hu said that this is not correct. We need to approach everything in a scientific manner. And let's just take the example of marriage. Now, you know the play by Henrik Ibsen. Is it The Doll's House? It's the story of a woman who is married. She has a husband, she has a son. And in the play, she realizes that she has lost her identity. You know, she was first the daughter of her parents, then she marries the husband, she becomes the property of the husband, and she serves him and the son. And she has a kind of awakening in this play. So Dr. Hu was very inspired by this. So he wrote a Chinese equivalent of this play, and it became very, very popular. And in the play, it's the woman, she's not married yet, but she's with her parents, and they're insisting that she has to marry the man chosen for her. And they have a very complicated debate about this, and they've consulted, you know, the fortune tellers and the astrologers, and, you know, there are many good reasons why she should marry him. But in the end, she doesn't. And so she leaves the room at the end, and the man she wants to marry is waiting in a car outside. We don't see him. And this play had enormous impact in China in the 1920s. And many ladies especially saw it, and they were inspired, and they didn't agree to marry the ones chosen by their parents. But you see, how do you change this practice in a society? You know, it's very hard to change. So Dr. Hu was trying to do it in a specific and particular way. Another thing he did was on the question of family planning. Of course, at that time, China had no family planning. There were very large families. So he invited a woman called Margaret Sanger, who was an American nurse from an Irish family. I think there were 17 children from the family. And she became the founder of family planning for women in the United States. and she went to prison because at that time many of these ideas were not acceptable. But Dr. Hu felt this was so important for Chinese women that he arranged for her to come, and she comes to Beijing and she gives lectures and he interprets, and Chinese journalists and reporters write articles about her and they appear in many Chinese magazines. And this was his way to try to create change in Chinese society. And I mean, both examples impress me very much. You know, he's trying to do it through the individual, through the example, rather than through the government decree. And of course, he knew what was going on in Soviet Union. He only went to Moscow once, but you know, he was very well informed and he could read English, so he would read what was published in the English media about Soviet Union. So there was an example of where an ism is controlling everything. And for him, this was a very good example of what China should not do. So that is why he was always against communism in China.
Great. Thank you. So please feel welcome to ask a question or give a feedback to.
Criticize, please. Criticize.
Yes, criticizing.
We have one question here. Please, yes, please. I will turn on the, yes.
I'm starting to read Dong Qiao's book on Hu Shih. As a student in the high school days, I remember an article called the 差不多先生 written by Dr. Hu, and was very impressed by his positive attitude towards transforming, changing China as a country. Now, I was very touched by your account of his confrontation with President Roosevelt in persuading him to step in to save China. No, this is a man of moral courage, not just for himself, but for the whole country, if not for the world. And I thank you for a very concise and very rich. You have been researching Dr. Hu for many years, and within, let's say, half an hour, very fluently and logically presented. I thank you.
Well, you are very polite. Thank you very much. But can I say one more thing about the meeting with Roosevelt? You know, as I say, all the countries had signed this agreement except United States, and Roosevelt was very likely to sign it. So Dr. Hu had only a very short time to act, and he had to be able to get a meeting with President Roosevelt to explain China's position. So this is really quite remarkable. I mean, as you know, ambassadors have a certain amount of power, but you know, they have no rights of meeting heads of states. You know, it's very limited. So it tells us that Hu had already established a very good relationship with Roosevelt before. The two men knew each other, and he could request a meeting with Roosevelt even at this critical moment, and Roosevelt would be willing to give it to him and invite him to come in. And also, he'd done his homework on President Roosevelt, and I think you know that Roosevelt personally was very sympathetic to the British, the Allies in Europe who were fighting Hitler, and was also personally sympathetic to President Chiang and China fighting Japan. But he was held back by this public opinion within the United States. So Dr. Hu had this very close relationship with Roosevelt. He was able to get the meeting, and because he understood all these factors, all this ambiance in which President Roosevelt was operating, he was able to convince him through his rhetoric and his passion not to sign it. So it was really a testimony to his, it was then almost 4 years' work in Washington that he was able to do this. And I think most ambassadors of most countries would not have got a meeting with Roosevelt at that moment and would not have been able to persuade him. But because of who Dr. Hu was, he was able to do it. So this chapter we call Saving China. I mean, maybe we exaggerate a little bit, but I think we can interpret the meeting in this way.
Mark, now we got a question on the chat room from Rebecca Choi. How is the current Chinese government's perspective on Dr. Hu? What would you say on this?
I'm afraid it's not so favorable. As I mentioned, in the 1950s, there was this mass campaign against him, initiated by Chairman Mao. So he's not widely read. He's not widely studied in school, but now the books are available. And I've given a couple of talks at Lingnan Daxue, and I was delighted to meet a PhD student there who is also from Anhui, and he's writing his dissertation about Dr. Hu. So he told me that amongst students of Chinese philosophy or Chinese literature in universities, there would be some knowledge of Dr. Hu. But I think among the general public, no, he's not well known. Now in Taiwan, on the other hand, it's different because there is a memorial hall to him in Taipei. That's where he spent the last 4 years of his life. He was very active in the 1950s. So he's a much more prominent figure. And I think among the Taiwan public, he's much better known.
I have a question about Hu Shih philosophy. Since he studied abroad and he got a Western perspective on scholarship and also was influenced by Dewey pragmatism, I would like to ask about his appreciation of the Chinese philosophy. I mean, in which tradition he would find himself more comfortable, which Chinese tradition he would appreciate more, and what would be the relevance of Chinese philosophy for modern times?
I'm afraid I find this question difficult to answer. I'm afraid I have not read in sufficient depth Dr. Hu's works on philosophy to give you. So my lovely wife says that the answer should be it's a hybrid. He was very influenced by the science, the democracy, the liberalism that he studied in the United States. But he was, he himself had read the classics as a young man. And so he was very influenced by Confucianism also. So he was a mixture of the two. And one point is very interesting is that whilst he and his wife had very little to say to each other, he remained loyal to her throughout his life, and she was always his wife. And Chiang Kai-shek, Sun Yat-sen, both had similar marriages arranged when they were young, and they both divorced their first wives, and they married other women. But Dr. Hu didn't do that. He always insisted that the wife he married when he was a very young man was his wife. And if I can just mention the case of Dr. Sun Yat-sen's wife, when he proposed to her that he wanted to marry Song Qingling, his wife said, "Fine, you can have her as a concubine, you can live with her, you can do whatever you want with her, but do not divorce me, because if you divorce me, I'm nothing. You're throwing me away. You're humiliating me in front of the public." So she begged him to do this, but he wouldn't do it. insisted on divorcing her because Song Qingling came from a Methodist family, and Song's mother insisted that to marry, the husband had to have only one wife. So here were two very important figures in Republican China, and they discarded their first wife, and Dr. Hu didn't. So in this sense, we can say he was a very filial to his mother and very pious toward his wife. So even though they had very little in common, he remained loyal to her.
We could make the link to Hong Kong, because Mark, you're very familiar with the situation in Hong Kong, and constantly in the last couple of years also reported on the situation in Hong Kong. Could we also kind of consider the situation with Hu Shih, his insistence on popular education and civil society? I think that he was very much attracted by civil society in the States. Could you make a kind of a link to Hong Kong society now? What would be the inspiration of Hu Shih, his enthusiasm for civil society, popular education in this situation of Hong Kong you know so well?
This is a difficult question.
Of course, I have to ask you difficult questions, not just easy.
How can I answer this without breaking the law? I think Dr. Hu was very impressed by the Western societies, especially American society, by the force of the civil society, of things that were done not by the government, but by companies and by individuals, by religious groups, by social groups. They had great power, ability to harness large numbers of people, to raise money, to run schools and universities, to do so many things that the government couldn't do or wouldn't do, or the government did badly. So I think Dr. Hu would find a lot in Hong Kong which he admired, because we also have here very vibrant Catholic churches, Protestant churches, Buddhist organizations, non-religious social organizations, civil societies. My mother-in-law, for example, who's 92, she goes to it's a civil organization for old people, and they run so many good programs. The government subsidizes most of the cost, and the staff who work there are really inspiring. I mean, they are paid, but they're not paid very much, and many of the people who attend are elderly and have some medical issues. But it's inspiring. So I think Dr. Hu would be very much in favor of all of that. But of course, when we move to the political side, then the situation here is now quite complex. So I think if Dr. Hu was here now, he would be quite disappointed. And in Taiwan in the 50s and the 60s, he had many arguments with President Chiang on this very issue. For example, in the 50s, he said to Chiang, look, you have to allow alternative parties to the Kuomintang. You have to allow newspapers, TV stations that are not run by the government. We need this for a pluralistic society. And President Chiang lost his temper, and he said, look, we did that in the mainland. And what was the result of being liberal and allowing some space for civil society? We were driven out. So I'm not going to make this mistake here in Taiwan. So as long as President Chiang was in power, there was martial law, and there was only one party, and there was only one owner of the media. It was only after he died, and then his son lift martial law and allow plurality of the media and of the political parties. So Dr. Hu won in the end in Taiwan, but he wasn't able to win, you know, during his lifetime. And President Jiang became very angry. He said, look, you are intellectual, you spend all your time in libraries, meetings, writing articles. You know, you do not live in the real world. You're not engaged in governing this society. So you're not qualified to make judgments about how the society should be run. So when I was giving the talk in Lingnan Daxue, one of the students from the mainland said that he was xiangjiao, you know, banana, xiangjiao. And you know the meaning of banana, which is yellow on the outside and white on the inside, that he was too much influenced by the Western liberalism. And so he thought this model could be used everywhere. So I think that would be a view of many people in the mainland, I think. Can I tell you a story about the love of his women? This is a very moving story.
By all means.
He was living in New York. It was the summer. And as you know, in New York, the summer is very hot and stuffy. And he was living in quite a small apartment. And the apartment was extremely hot. So one of his two main lady friends, this is Miss Williams, wrote to the other important American lady friend who was a nurse and said, Dr. Hu is suffering from the heat in his apartment. So we must spend $500, which is a lot of money at that time. And we together will buy an air conditioner so he can have a more comfortable summer. So the two ladies agreed to split the cost. And so each paid half for the air conditioner. Now, in the event, he declined. You know, he said it was too much money, and you know the weather was tolerable. But I thought it was a wonderful story of how he inspired these two ladies to cooperate, to help him. And you know, in most novels and TV dramas that you see, the story would be the reverse. You know, one lady would be trying to buy the air conditioner, and then the other lady would be trying to buy a better, more expensive air conditioner, and not let him know that the other one was trying to buy. You know, they would be competing. They would use any methods possible to prevent the other from buying the air conditioner and buying the air conditioner themselves. But in this case, the two ladies cooperated. So this was a way that he inspired the love among his lady friends. I found that very impressive.
I think that's also an excellent example of this pragmatic approach, the pragmatism. He felt so inspired. And another, I think, major philosopher you referred to, Thomas Huxley, also was arguing about this necessary prerequisites, you know, so to create a new cause. I think what is really astonishing in his life is, you know, 40,000 people attending his funeral, the tremendous impact on the life, including on ordinary people. So what we sometimes just dream of. Maybe could you elaborate also a bit more on this? I think why he succeeded in having such a profound impact also, that he truly touched, especially the life of Chinese people. So,
well, I remember when I lived in Taiwan, there were many jokes about the government, you know, Chiang Kai-shek and his wife and his children and his family, and you know, it was a one-party system. So I think many Taiwan people felt that, you know, they were angry with the way they were governed. You know, it was not a fair system. And at that time, the positions of power in the police, in the army, and in the government were all dominated by mainlanders who'd all come from mainland to Taiwan. So the way I read this popularity of Dr. Hu was that he represented an alternative to this. You know, he was a very fair person. He was not arrogant. He was not favoring one group over another. He was approachable. He was trying to make a fairer and more democratic society for Taiwan. And yeah, I think they saw him as representing an alternative to this very authoritarian model which they had. Yeah, and I must say it is really extraordinary that so many people should you know, go to the funeral home for a public intellectual. I think his contribution to science is obviously very important. That has been one of the keys of Taiwan's development. And it's completely man-made. I mean, Taiwan has no conditions to be a home of science and high technology. I mean, it's a small island with very limited resources. This is entirely something which has been introduced and added to the country, just like in Japan or in South Korea. So I think he would get credit for that also. Also, he was humorous. You know, he was very public. He would give lectures all the time and meet people, and you know, very, very sociable. And I think a lot of the government figures at the time were not. And if I could just give you this is a story. It's not really to do with Hu, but just to summarize the ambience in Taiwan at that time. A friend explained that in the late 50s, he and his family were watching a speech by President Chiang Kai-shek on television. And as you know, Chiang Kai-shek had a very thick Ningbo accent. So he was speaking Mandarin, but it was a very thick accent. And it was very hard for Taiwan people to understand what he was saying unless you were from that place. And it was considered impolite to have the subtitles, because if you had subtitles, that would suggest people couldn't understand him. And that's insulting to the great leader. So the family are watching this broadcast by President Chiang Kai-shek with no subtitles, and he speaks for 15 minutes. And then they turn off the TV, and there's a silence around the table. And then the father asks his wife, well, what was the president telling us? So the wife says, well, the bus prices in Taipei are going up by 20% tomorrow. And then the wife asks the son, what was he telling us? And the son says, the exports of pineapples next year will increase by 30%, a great success for agriculture. And then the son asks the father, what did he tell us? And the father says, well, the date for the invasion of mainland has been brought forward 1 year, and what happened next year? I mean, all this is complete nonsense. No one had a clue what he was saying. But I mean, the story tells us the gap between the Taiwan public and the leaders at that time, you know. And the only way they would know is when they bought the newspaper the next day, and then it would be written, you know, in the characters the next day. So I think in this sort of ambience, I think a person like Dr. Hu would be very popular and approachable and a very attractive alternative to this authoritarian rule.
In this case, I would just myself ask you, I know you're very humble person, but maybe your message you could convey, because first of all, I have to communicate to everybody here, you are certainly our linguistic model. I think besides your Irish English, you speak Japanese, Cantonese, Mandarin, French. So you are a shining model for us for systematic linguistic learning. But for tonight, of course, I would like to ask you if you have a message, because it's true, Hu Shih conveys an optimistic note and a fresh breeze also of innovative thinking. So maybe, as we are so shy of a question, may I ask you to have a final word, what you want to convey, also maybe why you have chosen to devote so much time and energy in penetrating the thought. What is a message you want to convey for tonight for us?
Yeah, I think you explained it very well. I think Chinese history in the 20th century is full of tragedy and death and catastrophes, man-made ones, natural ones caused by foreign invasions. And so we want to see something very positive and hopeful. And Dr. Hu didn't say, the Chinese spirit is better than the foreign spirit or the Japanese spirit. And he wasn't nationalist. But yeah, he definitely believed in the human spirit and that things can be improved and any problem can be examined and you can find a solution to the problem. And you can move forward. So I think this spirit is very encouraging for us. I mean, the world at the moment is more and more bleak. I mean, this morning I woke up, I switched on the television, and we seem to be close to World War III in Europe. That's right. And where's the human spirit, the human endeavor, optimism in all this? So that was the spirit I got from Dr. Hu. I mean, when he was in Cornell, he made friends with all the students, with the Indian students, the Filipino students, the American Indian students, the black students. He was not at all prejudiced. He wrote in one of his letters, he said, before he went to America, he was a typical Chinese nationalist. He looked down on everybody who was not Chinese. But once he got there and he met them face to face and he talked to them, he changed his attitude. So this was an outlook that he kept throughout his life. And for example, even with Japanese, I mean, the Japanese invasion of China is one of the war crimes of the 20th century, but that didn't stop him from remaining friends with Japanese scholars and academics that he knew, and he had common research interests with them. And we have photographs of him with them. And this also I find very encouraging, because the world is now going in the opposite direction. I mean, it is one nation against another nation, one race against another race, the rich fighting against the poor. And he would take us in the opposite direction. I first heard about Dr. Hu when I was in Taipei, and one of our teachers came in and said, "You know what Chinese you are learning?" And we said, "We don't know." And he said, "You are learning the Chinese of Dr. Hu. If it wasn't for Dr. Hu, you would be learning the classical Chinese, You would be here for 10 years, and then you might just master it. But thanks to Dr. Hu, you are learning the Baihuawen, the vernacular Chinese, so that you can master in a much shorter time." So as I said earlier, I think maybe that's his biggest contribution, that he popularized the language. He raised the level of literacy in China by several degrees. And I think that's something he learned again in the United States. You know, why is the United States a successful country? Because many people can contribute. You know, they can do something, they can learn, they can make products, they can set up companies, they can invent things. But to do that, they need a minimum of literacy, which is what he found in the United States. So if China is going to catch up with the other countries, she has to have a language which enables people to do this. So yes, that was a great thing too. Yeah, I think we need 1,000 Doctor Who's now, here in Taiwan and in the PRC. Yeah.
Mark, would anybody like to ask maybe a last question? Otherwise, Mark, I would really like to thank you very much indeed. For everybody, I would like to hint that a brilliant article is in issue number 8 of the Macau Ricci Institute Journal, interview on the philanthropic movement of Hu Shih in Taiwan. So that's really most inspiring, one of the most influential philanthropic movements you know very well. So
could you send us 2 copies, please? And I will send it to the master in Hualien.
Oh, sure.
And she will be very happy, and she will invite you to Hualien, and you will become a member. And I'm afraid you won't have so much time for your work at the institute. You will have to do a lot of voluntary work with the foundation, and it's not paid. Okay?
Good. Yeah. Okay. I will do that. And really, thanks you very much. And for everybody, in the information is also the link where you can buy. Mark has published 13 books, and I think tonight it was really very deeply inspiring how you kind of, through Dr. Hu Shih, you opened new horizons, and especially also the kind of really deep sense of curiosity, intellectual curiosity, and kind of joy to go deeper in our analysis. So thanks, Mark, and all.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to everybody for listening. You're very patient and staying until the end. Thank you very much.